Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show. All right, and with that, returning to The Brian Nichols Show. It's been a while, but welcome back to the program, Shoshana Weissmann.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Shoshana, it's been quite a while since I think you were last on the show. I was going back into the archives. You ready for this? We're on episode 374, I think. You were originally, you ready? Episode 45.
Wow.
We've come a long way, Shoshana. So first and foremost, thank you for being one of the OGs here on the Brian Nichols Show. And thank you for making it through as we get to now going towards episode 400. My goodness. But let's start off because obviously there's been a lot that has transpired, not only in terms of what's going on in the world, but here on the program, we're reaching hundreds of new people every single episode than we did back before we had our conversation with you back in, I think, 2018 it was. So, Shoshana, let's go ahead, dig into, number one, what's been going on in the world of Shoshana Weissmann, but number two, what do you find is your role as we pertain ourselves to here, the greater liberty world, and specifically your work at R Street Institute?
So it's so funny. I didn't realize it had been that long either. So many things feel like it was just yesterday. But yeah, during the pandemic, at the very beginning, I thought I was going to have nothing to do. I'm like, well, no one needs licensing reform as it relates to the pandemic. And then nurses and doctors weren't allowed to work across state lines. And other people had to move, or telehealth was a big thing. You know, maybe you worked in one place, but you spent time with your family during COVID, so you could all be together, and you couldn't see your same doctors, especially mental health professionals. And my work just got crazy. I really wasn't expecting it, but basically explaining to people hey, these waivers are really good. They work. It hasn't caused any more harm, and they work in better times as well. And we need to make sure that we're not so horribly unprepared for any pandemic in the future that we can't do this again. And making sure that we have that flexibility, because during the pandemic, there are hotspots all over the country towards the beginning. But having the flexibility to say Kansas is fine, Kansas isn't really facing anything. Healthcare professionals from there can go to, let's say, Oregon and focus on that without any problems. That's something that's really important. In addition to just when times are hard, just getting rid of barriers is really important. So more people have been understanding that. More people have understood the value of regulatory reform in the healthcare space, which isn't something I ever expected to see, but I'm really, really excited about it because it's important. We want to make sure nurses aren't stopped by doctors from engaging in their expertise, or that pharmacists aren't stopped from nurses and doctors from engaging in their expertise, and everyone can access more healthcare because we pay for a system. The system has a lot of problems, but at the very least, we shouldn't stop people who have the skills from being able to contribute to their positions.
Well, and I think right now that is the big thing that's on everyone's top of mind is how are we seeing right now hundreds of hospitals just laying off or just outright firing nurses, doctors en masse? And is it because they do have really control on the ability to decide who is and is not going to be allowed to practice medicine just by the sheer nature that they control the area that can take place?
So it's interesting. On that side, it's a little bit less regulatory. I mean, there's real problems with competition, but if more places were able to open up, certificate of need is a really big problem. You'd probably be seeing less of that if there's more competition for staff. And that more facilities were able to open up, and certificate of need laws often make it so if you want to open a new healthcare thing, you have to get approval from existing healthcare things to make sure that you can do it, whether it's an MRI clinic or something like that. It applies to non-healthcare stuff too, but it's a big thing here. But it's just not smart to lay off all those people who have those skills and who have that expertise. And to have their skills go to waste. It's really, really dangerous. And we need, we're always in a healthcare shortage, but during the pandemic, it got so much worse. And it floors me that they wouldn't realize that very real concern, laying off new staff, laying off staff now.
Yeah, well, you talked about the certificate of need laws, and let's bring this to something that everybody gets to enjoy, telecommunications, right? That's my day job. But think specifically your cable provider. If I'm in the Northeast, could be Comcast. It could be, which was formerly Time Warner, now Spectrum. You have Verizon, Fios. Just imagine if anytime a new provider wanted to just exist in an area, that they had to get the approval of Comcast, Verizon, and
Yeah.
Spectrum. That doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense from a healthcare perspective either. And I'm seeing right now a lot of people, Shoshana, they're looking at the system and they're saying, number one, what? This is a
Yeah.
thing? And number two, how do we fix it? So, Shoshana, I know that's a lot, right? Here, magic wand, fix the healthcare system. But let's say you had to give people, a couple of actionable steps that they can start to take. What would that look like?
So I don't do anything in health insurance. So health insurance is totally out of my area. But with just healthcare regulations, I mean, and all certificate of need laws, it's abbreviated to con laws a lot, and it is a con. It's crap. It's whether it's moving companies or MRI clinics. Companies shouldn't have to get approval from one another. If there's bigger issues in systems, we can talk through that. But like in the 70s, I think it was, we decided, oh, let's do con laws. And it's been a disaster ever since for every state that implemented it. So we should stop doing that. Furthermore, just expanding scope of practice as much as possible for nurses, pharmacists, let all of them, give vaccines, let pharmacists prescribe more stuff over the counter if it's safe for them to, whether it's birth control or whether it's tobacco cessation products. Just make sure that they can provide as much healthcare as they can, because during the worst of times, it takes extreme strain off of regular providers. And during the best of times, it's just easier access for normal people. Stop letting doctors control nurses. It's a really bad model. Doctors in too many cases prevent nurses from giving some primary care service, which they're able to do, which they're trained to do. And in many states they do. And it lowers costs, improves health outcomes. So it works. So do a lot more of that. And there's just so many little and big regulations to get rid of, whether it's, that we can't work across state lines. This is kind of like a weird thing where we actually need to add regulations in effect to get rid of them. Say, hey, no matter what state you work in, you can come here and work. You can transfer your license really easily. Let's have foreign doctors work here if they're already here, and in so many cases they are, and they can't practice what they know. Let them transfer into the system at the very least. Or if their credentials are the same, why not let that transfer? We don't have any real mechanism for that outside of a very small handful of countries. But if people have training, we shouldn't make them go through 10, 12 years again just to do the thing they were already doing. And in too many cases, it's not worth it. So we need to stop the brain drain. All of this is just very simple stuff that helps everyone. There's no danger, because it's either like expanding our regulatory system or having ways for stuff to transfer into it. There's no reason that it shouldn't work that way. And if we got rid of all these problems, during pandemics or during various natural disasters, people could go from one place to another and work there without having to worry about government coming after them. And of course, get rid of licenses that aren't needed. But I'm fine with doctor and nurse licenses, though I do think there's ways to shorten the process a little bit, because it takes quite a long time to become a doctor. And there's a lot of other barriers in becoming a doctor that we could definitely get rid of.
Yeah, well, I mean, you go back to talking about the licenses. I just read. Okay, I didn't read. I saw a meme. But the meme was referring to this one pilot who just got fired, not with regards to what's going on with the COVID stuff, but he got caught not having a pilot's license, and he'd been flying for 30 years. And somebody had responded to like that original post, and they said, "You'd think at that point they just let him keep flying,
Yeah.
right?" And that's the common sense, like, yeah, that makes sense answer. And yet, based on the way that the regulations are in the licensure laws, it actually doesn't make sense. And we're seeing this right now really rear its ugly head, Shoshana, in terms of other jobs that are out there with occupational licensing, and all of a sudden being hit with this completely out of left field thing called the COVID-19 pandemic. So I would love to hear kind of what have been the stories you've been hearing in regards to the impact on those people outside of your traditional healthcare situation, where obviously occupational licensing plays a huge role. But let's think about some of the lesser talked about occupational licenses jobs out there, and what was their direct impact in regards to COVID?
So it's interesting because during this is kind of an aside, but during national or state emergencies where it's like one area hit by like a natural disaster. Think of stuff like that. A lot of times they'll temporarily waive contractors or other related professionals, whether it's plumbers or something like that, to be able to come in and do work without having to have problems. We definitely need more of those on the books, but on the books, not as executive orders. There's a lot of licensing reform that was temporary and great, and some of it became permanent. But so many of the legislators were like, okay, we're going to go do other stuff now. And I'm like, you might want to like make this permanent so there's regulatory certainty, because if a nurse doesn't know that they can, comfortably work in another place and not have to deal with crushing liability for trying to help people out, that's a really big deal. And then even with cosmetologists, it was really interesting because, during the early pandemic, especially, a lot of salons were shut down, and I actually didn't oppose it, knowing what I knew at the time. Now, looking back, I'm not so sure, but the concern of disease spreading there was not new to me, because cosmetologists often argue that if someone isn't licensed, they'll spread disease, whether it's hair braiders or stuff like that. And the fact is that licensed salons are the ones spreading diseases. The rates are out of this world. It's just really, really high rates of infection spread. So I'm like, they didn't clean up their act. We don't have a regulatory system that actually protects people in salons. Instead, we add on lots and lots of burdens. It makes us feel like we're protecting people, but it's not. So I'm fine with maybe switching out some licensing for health inspections, make sure stuff is clean and that that everything's being treated right, because, most infections will go away and it's fine, but still, you don't want to have places like that. And again, even during the worst of times, when we have this overly burdensome system, it didn't even benefit the cosmetologists because they had to be shut down too. At the same time, there were officials who would still go to salons during while everything was shut down, and that was obviously ridiculous. There's plenty of that. But the way it all works is very strange. So too many of our regulations don't protect. They just make us feel like they're protecting. And I don't mind regulations that actually protect people, but like, when they don't, it's okay. Like, let's switch it out for something that does the thing you want it to do, or let's get rid of it all if it's not working, because that doesn't make any sense. But it was very strange to see how many professions just had all these different kinds of waivers. Most of them were at least a little healthcare related, but now some of it's gone into mental health, and like their telehealth in Arizona and Florida have like really, really expanded over the past couple of years. And I think states in general have just understood that these crushing burdens don't serve us well when our country is struggling, and our country will struggle at various times for things in and out of our control. But when you have all these barriers in the way that make it just impossible for people to get back on their feet, that's why I've started to seek even cosmetologists, which are kind of known to not like any form of deregulation, to support some of it, which has just been awesome. I love seeing it, but it's shocking to me, as someone who's worked on this issue for so long. But there's still a lot that hasn't been touched. There's a lot of the legacy licenses. The Louisiana Florence license is still there. It drives me nuts. There's all kinds of unnecessary licenses all over, but there is some more interest in understanding in making it better. Before that, and there was some understanding starting in the past couple of years before the pandemic that, like, look, licensing reform can be really important for everyone across the aisle. Everyone from Trump to Obama to Tom Cotton to, Gene Shaheen all kind of understood that. But really during the pandemic, I think people started to really internalize the real effects it can have, the lack of good it does, and maybe we should rethink how we're doing this. So it's been encouraging, but I wish it didn't have to come about this way.
I mean, don't we all? And I think what you said really just encapsulates everything from the regulations to the licensures to what we've just seen for the past almost 2 years now. And it's policy being done in the name of making you feel like you're going to be safe. And yet, and this is the funny part, I mean, it's not funny, but if you don't laugh, you'll cry. You end up finding out that actually, you're not as safe. Not only are you not as safe, you're less safe in many cases. You mentioned there the specific example with the beauty salon. That's amazing, because it goes into just so much, not only in terms of how we act when we vote, looking for that sense of security, but I mean, since we had you in the show last time, Shoshana, we've really changed the show to more of a sales and marketing approach to liberty in politics. And one of the things we talk about in sales is the idea that emotion sells. And the number one emotion that will always sell above everything else is fear. And with that, how you can apply fear to a sense of security and safety. Right. And it's just it's sales. I mean, and that's what drives me crazy is because now you've only got one option. Your option is the top-down option. And if you have this essentially monopoly on fear, all of a sudden, everything can become terrifying. Everyone becomes a threat. And it opens up the door for how much we've seen already take place in terms of the excessive regulation, the excessive licensures. It's happening in the past. It's happening now. Can we stop it from happening in the future, Shoshana?
Yeah, I think we just need to keep on the messaging side. I'm a giant nerd, but I've learned how to be less of a nerd just, to talk to people about real issues because I care about the principles, but I also care about the people harmed by stuff. And I think we need to remind people about that because the principles matter, but so do the real life effects. Even though real life effects don't always warrant higher regulation, but it's often because the regulation won't solve the problem. So people lobby for regulations, even good people lobby for regulations that don't solve things. And then the things keeps going on. And then we keep getting more regulations because this time it'll be solved. And I just kind of remind people like, hey, here's, when something bad is being proposed, I'll remind people here's a similar regulatory dynamic or, okay, you want to stop this. This doesn't do that. This doesn't solve that problem. And just making sure we understand that with people. There are problems I don't think government can solve that it tries to. But even again, I like to use cosmetology as an example because it's something everyone kind of understands. Everyone gets haircuts. I tried to learn how to cut my own hair. It did not work. I mean, I wasn't bad, but I was just like.
Surprisingly, I had a lot easier of a time with it.
You did? Oh,
I did.
What about your long flowing locks? How did
Shoshana,
you?
that was at least 11 years ago.
My life is so hard. My hair is always such a Jufro. It's always just such a challenge to get it right. So I cut the bangs once during or a couple of months ago, but I realized there's no way I'm going to be able to get the ends right. So most of us, unless you're really, really good at cutting stuff that you can't see in the back of your head, are gonna, go to salons. And I think that when you understand, of course, you want to make sure it's safe and gross stuff can happen, but that the regulations aren't solving that, then we need to rethink, okay, is there nothing we can do? And in this case, I really think it should be treated like any food establishment. Hey, just come around. Don't put in insane regulations that the paper towels have to be this high above this thing, all those kind of dumb ones that happen. But focus on real, hey, is this sanitized or do they have regular sanitation processes? Do they keep sanitation stuff around? Are they handling everything that they need to with gloves? Little things like that I think can be done very rationally. And even though I think a lot of the food regulations sometimes go a little bit overboard, it's a lot better than it not working. And then all these extra regulations that you have to wait years and years to become a cosmetologist. That's not helpful. I want everyone to have the opportunity. But it's not solving the problem. And I'm sick of regulations that don't. And I think more people are getting it on the left and the right. It's really encouraging. But there's a lot of opportunity to make stuff change because people are getting it.
Yeah, well, and you just went towards the right part of the conversation, or my head was going towards it as well, and that is looking at building these solutions. I mean, obviously, the libertarians in the audience, they're saying, well, why don't we just, go ahead and have independent organizations start to do the licensure themselves, but it's outside of government. We hear you. We trust us. We hear you, but we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room first, and that is a lot of these licenses and regulations already exist from that state level. Now, Shoshana, you mentioned a few states. You mentioned, I think it was Florida. You mentioned Arizona doing pretty well here throughout the pandemic. But beyond that, are there other states you can look to just from either A, helping reduce a lot of the burden in terms of licensure, but also number two, maybe in terms of starting to actually pull back in terms of not only the licensing, but also regulations? Do you see any states beyond Florida and Arizona leading the charge, or is it mostly focused in those two states?
So always look to Arizona because I adore Governor Ducey. We disagree sometimes, but he's not only a wonderful person, but a really, really good he has a great regulatory brain. He gets the stuff. He knows all the stuff I'm telling you he would agree with. He comes from that perspective, and he works for the legislature, and they have some great legislators there too to get this stuff done. So if you're looking for an example, Arizona's done almost everything you can do, minus chip away at those like licenses we still don't need. And that's a harder thing to do because that's when lobbies get involved and it's a whole thing. But if you want to look for examples, look there. But there is always more. Spencer Cox in Utah, the governor there, is super into this. So he's been doing more here. The governor of Colorado, if a new dumb license comes up, he's like, no, we're not doing this. And he'll veto it. I appreciate that. Florida's done a lot. They have more to do, but they're doing very well. They've also added some really dumb regulations, which I don't love. And then you'll see movement all over the country. Pennsylvania, the Democratic governor there, Polis is also Democrat, but it's nice to see both parties doing it. The Pennsylvania Democratic governor, Tom Wolf, keeps signing, licensing reform, and he'll make a big deal out of it, showing like he understands why this is important. New Hampshire's governor as well. There's interest all over, and it's so encouraging. Most states are doing something, which is nuts, but there's lots of states that aren't. The Southeast is kind of one area that's kind of hard to do stuff with, and I'm not exactly sure why. There's just certain political dynamics there, and also in very blue states where you tend to see that as well. I just don't think one party rule tends to serve people well. That said, California recently got rid of 600 extra hours to become a cosmetologist. So now they're down to 1,000, which is actually one of the lower states now. So it's cool to see even California doing that stuff. It's not to say any of the states I'm mentioning aren't also doing awful stuff, but they're starting to get it a little bit more. I think people are starting to realize, okay, if I want my state to succeed, I can't just constantly throw barrels and the people coming towards me who want to do the good work. So there's stuff all over, but there's still lots to do in most states unless you're Arizona.
Well, I'm going to say this, and I don't know what your thoughts are, but I would say also, you mentioned a state like California. Now, I'm a sales guy, and I have to reverse engineer and think, well, what, beyond, are they actually, feeling good about doing this? Or is there something else that they're feeling, an undiscovered pain? I think I found it. They're missing out on revenue. Because what's happening, Shoshana, if you're a beautician, if you're, a barber, and you're going out and you're like, F this, I'm not getting a license. I know I can cut hair and I'm really good. We're just going to do this under the table. And guess what? I'm paying 0 taxes. And you multiply that across the board with how many people were just saying, the barriers are too big. The service still needs to get done. I'll figure out a way. And with the advent of new technologies, it makes it a lot easier for people to be able to do that. So is it wrong of me to maybe speculate that some of these maybe more money-driven states, and let's be real, that's all the states when they're trying to get their revenue, is there maybe a little bit of a double incentive here, not just the feel good, but also the dollars and cents?
So dollars and cents, but not in that way. You're not wrong. But I haven't seen data showing that that's a really big piece of it. I think it's more that people aren't moving up the ladder and therefore they're not paying more taxes. So it is kind of that way, but it's a little bit different. And consider this as well, that there's many stories of people who are doing things without a license and they get caught, and sting operations, like nuts stuff. So I think that they usually tend to catch people like that. It's stupid and it's nuts and it's not a good use of government resources. But a good example is this one military spouse who moved from California, where you don't need a license to give nutritional advice, to Florida, where you do. They finally got rid of it this year or last year, and I was very thankful for that. But she was a CrossFit trainer and also gave, eat cauliflower and stuff like that. And they did sting operations. The state did sting operations to say, to catch her doing it, and really, really went after her. So her doing this in a smaller capacity still, it was nuts how it went, but they tend to catch those people. So I'd be surprised if a lot of that went out, goes under the radar. I'm sure it does to an extent, but I don't think it's as big because it is kind of difficult. Even the famous Louisiana florist case, in super brief, an elderly widow had never had to work before. So she knew floristry. So she tried to get the florist license. At the time, the pass rate to be a florist, to get that license, was lower than the pass rate to be barred in Louisiana. It was nuts. And obviously it's not because flowers are super much harder and more dangerous than law, but she eventually went working technically illegally in that way for a grocery. state authorities found that out that she was, and they told the grocery, either you fire this elderly widow or we're closing you down. So I don't blame the grocery. There's nothing they could have done that had a better outcome for her. But when she ended up dying, she was in poverty at the time because of government. And like, they catch people. They like, it's awful and it's stupid, but they tend to catch people. I'm sure there are under the table operations, and I know that that's not super infrequent, but I think that a bigger chunk of it really is that they're like, hey, we want dues paying members, rather than like worrying about the under the table stuff.
Well, and you know what that means, though? That means we gotta start telling more of these stories because,
Yeah.
I mean, I know for a fact that we have filmmakers who listen to this show. So take stories like that, guys, and turn it into something that your average person can take away and say, that's messed up. I mean, Shoshana, are you watching Squid Games right now?
No, oh my gosh, my dad was just telling me about it. I had not heard about it before he mentioned it. I'm not a good youth. I still watch like South Park and and Simpsons older cartoons, but like the early days of them. Should I be watching Squid Games?
It's an experience.
Okay.
I think it's also just so you can stay up to date in the contemporary conversations, but also to the fact that, I mean, just looking at the people who I know are watching Squid Games, that I'm hearing the conversations that they're having, and they're very emotional conversations because, I mean, not giving any spoiler alerts here for the show, but the entire premise is that I think it's 456 people go to play a game. And long story short, they're either indebted to, creditors, they're indebted to governments, individuals, and this is a chance for them to win back their money in a quote unquote fair, equal playing field. But when you are eliminated from the certain games that you're playing, you're actually eliminated. You get shot, killed, something along those lines. And it's going through this game that they've been playing. I think it's 6 games or so. And people who are watching the show, I'm hearing the conversations that they're having and the intensity that they have about these conversations. And it hits me. I'm like, this is a fake story. Just imagine if we could make something that they could consume that tells the real stories and not
Oh, yeah.
not the Hollywood, the dramatization, based on a true story. No, like actually a story. Like tell the actual story that happened, because that alone, it being real and authentic and happened to a sad old lady, an old widow. Come on, like that means something to people. So,
Oh yeah.
wow. Sorry, Shoshana, I didn't mean to go on a rant there.
Well, I mean, that story is why I got involved in licensing reform. I'd always been passionate about unenumerated rights because, like, the Ninth Amendment says we have them, and so does the 14th Privileges or Immunities Clause. That like the short list isn't our rights. It's like these are our rights. This is just a little bit of them. But when I heard about her story, when I was like, gosh, I think I was 28 or 21 at the time. I'm like, okay, well, this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. So like,
And you know what? There's a million more Shoshanas out there who they'll hear that story and they'll get activated too. And I know we have to wrap up here because you're hard pressed for time, and I'll turn the conversation towards this as we wrap up. This is exciting because the conversation has started. People are already seeing what's happening, not only in the past 2 years when COVID hit, but if you were to go ask somebody in your circle, say, hey, do you know someone who is, a beautician, is a barber, is a healthcare worker, is name licensed job here? Everybody's going to raise their hand. They're going to say, yeah, I know somebody. And you can talk to that person and have a difference in the ability to change their mind by making it real. And it's telling these stories, having these conversations, but also helping people see that there are actually things they can do. And that's the biggest thing that we've missed is people just will be like, wow, this really sucks. Now what? And Shoshana, you're giving them a now what. So let's do this. As we wrap up the conversation, I want to give you a platform to make sure that people see the call to action. So obviously, you're doing a lot of great work. You're not only talking to amazing people who are making differences happen, but also you're writing about it over at our street. So with that being said, Shoshana, number 1, what can people do? Number 2, where can people go ahead and follow you if they want to continue the conversation?
thank you. Yeah. So the top thing is praise people doing good things. I may hate like Governor Newsom a good chunk of the time, but when he does something good, I'll praise him. Sometimes I yell at him too, but usually praising I find more effective. So it depends on the situation, but really praise the people doing good things, even if you don't like them, but when they're doing good things. And then also kind of know who you're voting for. Just, keep an eye out and stuff. And thankfully, most people kind of get licensing reform. And I doubt you're a single issue licensing reform voter. But really, just try to learn about the candidates, learn about the people that they want to be like. No one's ever right 100% of the time, but it's good to have an eye on that stuff. And then, when you have opportunity to get involved, just like, to be activisty and like protest for licensing reform, or really more often it's just going to be sharing with friends and family, like, hey, this is a thing that matters and this is a thing we should want more of, because elected officials, regulators, they all respond to what the public wants. I don't think it's always the best that they do, because I think sometimes there should be principles that go beyond populism, but knowing that they do, it's an effective way. And then really just being informed. And then so you can follow me at Senator Shoshana on Twitter, and my job at RSI on Twitter. We do lots of work far beyond this. Most of what you'll see isn't that, but we do a lot of really fun work, and I'm really thankful to be there.
Shoshana, there's a great saying from the one and only sales guru, expert, I don't know what you want to call him, coach, Jeffrey Gitomer. And he says, love what you do or don't fucking do it. Yep. And Shoshana, it's obvious you love what you do. And when other people can show that they love what they do, it will inspire other people to say, why? Why does she love what she does? And it gives you the opportunity to tell people, because I'm making a difference and I'm seeing that difference. And Shoshana, I think that is one of the best things that we can actually take away from this episode, is that there are things people can do. And yes, praise good people when they do good things. And with that being said, folks, if you want to go ahead and make sure that we're raising up good people who are doing good things, please be sure to go ahead, give today's episode a share. And when you do, give Shoshana a tag. I will include all of the links here in the show notes. Click the artwork and it'll bring you right to the Brian Nichols Show page here for today's episode, along with the entire transcription for today's episode, plus all 370 other episodes over on the Brian Nichols Show. With that being said, Shoshana Weissmann, thanks for joining the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.